The Mt Hanley School was a single-room schoolhouse that started up in the 1850s and it functioned as such until 1963. In later years, it was turned into the Mt Hanley Schoolhouse Museum. It is in the small community of Mt Hanley, about 2 hours southwest of Halifax in the Annapolis Valley. It is reminiscent of many other single-room schoolhouses that were designed by William Dawson in that era. At the time, the local schoolhouse was the center of the community, residing beside the post office and general store. In this single-room institute, children of all ages were taught from primary to grade 12 until shortly after Middleton Regional High School was finished in the late 40s, after which only elementary grades were taught at the schoolhouse. Very few people made it to grade 12, as most people had to help back on the homestead. After the closure in 1963, when it and many other small schoolhouses were consolidated, the property was bought by the adjacent landowner, Alden Bardo. After his purchase, he began to preserve much of the contents from the school, as well as other artifacts from the local area. There are still some original desks, with others from nearby schools situated in the museum, many of which have all of the etchings present from students in the past. There are even school records from before the 20th century. There has been several notable people who have attended the school, such as Clara Bell Marshall, who is the first woman to graduate from Acadia University, as well as being one of the earliest females to graduate in Canada. Ralph Murphy also attended the school before going off to fight in the Korean War, where he would later be killed in action. Then there is Joshua Slocum, who is the most well-known of all the students at the school. As he was the first person to sail solo around the world, Slocum was born in Mt Hanley and lived there until he was 8 years old. There are still some records of his attendance available at the school. In 2005, Alden Bardo and his wife Loretta wanted the museum to be run on after they could no longer run it themselves. Thus, the Mt Hanley Schoolhouse Museum Society was created and run by members of the community. The museum was then handed over to the community on the agreement that it would be open to the public in the summer months. This then led to the museum becoming a tourist attraction that made money through three-wheel donations and sale of merchandise. The main pull for tourism is the presence of authentic artifacts ranging mostly from 1850 to 1950, along with being the first school that Joshua Slocum attended. Among the array of merchandise that may be purchased is a book written by a former student of the Mt Hanley School, who also went on to graduate from Acadia University, Ora Blossom Elliott. Her book, The History of Mt Hanley, painstakingly details things like the type of buildings in the community, the layout of Mt Hanley, and the occupants and their employment. There is also a chapter on the indigenous people of the area, how they lived, and some of the tools and buildings they used and occupied. This book is by far the most common souvenir bought by tourists. It gives a look back into history through the rosy-tinted glasses that most older tourists tend to enjoy. One of the high points of the museum is a map from 1864 that shows the county of Annapolis. What makes this map special is that every single family who lived in the Annapolis Valley at the time is listed on the map, along with the occupations of people who worked. As can be seen, there were still many Slocums in the area in 1864, some of which were mariners as well. The map also shows an overview of the Maritimes and the communities that were present at that time. It even shows zoomed-in pictures of certain larger communities, such as Annapolis Royal. The museum also has several other maps of Canada, each with their own interesting features. For example, this is a map of the Dominion of Canada and Newfoundland before they joined Canada as a province. There is also no Nunavut, only one large Northwest Territory. As you can see, this second map, which is from around the beginning of the 1900s, appears dramatically different from the present-day Canada. The provinces Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan in those days encompassed different land areas than they do currently. There are even some districts like that of Assiniboia that no longer exist. This third map shows the fur trading routes in Canada at that time, as well as what pellets were produced, along with some other features, such as trading outposts. There are many items that are still left from the original school, as Alden bought the schoolhouse promptly after its closure. Among many things, like abacuses, chalkboards, and the textbooks, there are the desks, some of which are from the school and others from the nearby Outram Schoolhouse. These desks are arranged so that those at the front are the smallest for the youngest kids and increase in size to the back of the school. because as the students went up in the grades and grew, they moved farther back in the classroom. The desks all have a spot for inkwells, although not all of these inkwells were originally from this schoolhouse. Gordon Foster, my grandfather, the second boy in from the bottom right, can recall how the boys would dip the girls' pigtails into the inkwells, only to be quickly punished by the teacher if caught. The authenticity of these desks is best shown by looking at the typical work left behind by many of the students. Carving. Among all the destruction, the initials of many previous students can be seen in the desks. The textbooks left behind show how different education was back then. Although many of the books are classics like Alice in Wonderland, there are many textbooks for classes that most high schools no longer have, such as Latin and botany. Along with all the students' supplies, there are still some of the teachers' materials like the school bells. Another relic of a bygone era is the leather straps. They certainly demonstrate how much modern education has changed from the teaching methods of just a few generations ago. Aside from the many schoolhouse treasures to be found, Alton Bardo had also collected some relics that would have been used all around Nova Scotia. There are some items from nearby indigenous communities, such as hand-woven reed baskets from the village of Bear River. There are numerous tools in this collection that would have been used by locals. Examples include such equipment as buggy wrenches, which are pretty much non-existent now, to lanterns and hand tools like axes, which are still used in some minor capacity. Apples were, and still are, a very big business in the Annapolis Valley, and this is reflected by the large amount of apple stencils that are in the museum. These stencils were used to mark on the name of the type of apples being stored in the barrel, along with the producer's name in some instances. The museum also has many tools that were used in the production of barrels, for both apples and other products. A much smaller part of the museum that focuses on larger, more modern equipment, which is not quite as aged as the aforementioned relics, but still played an important role in the local history. Things such as radios, typewriters, sewing machines, and lathes. As Alton Bardo collected all sorts of antiques, the space provided in the single-room schoolhouse really wasn't enough for all of his collectibles, so he constructed a small woodshed that is attached to the main building. This room contains a lot of trinkets that don't relate specifically to the original schoolhouse, but they are relevant to the lifestyles of that era. Some of these items range all the way from small personal care products to mechanical kitchen equipment. There are lots of common items that most people can identify, like cola bottles, skates, and cowbells, to more eccentric things like an old hearing aid. Tools like the washing board and scales really show just how far technology has come in the last 100 years. Another significant difference is in the products that were available then versus now. Many common products, such as calendars, were sponsored by tobacco companies, along with a swath of tobacco products. The general production of goods was also very different, as there was very little plastic available, so most packaging involved the use of paper, glass, or metal. Surprisingly, some modern brands seen today can be found on some of the artifacts in the museum, like Maxwell's coffee. Mr. and Miss Bardo, like many people in Canada, were quite interested in the British royal family, and this has been reflected in the pictures on the walls of the Mt Hanley Schoolhouse Museum. The pictures span across the last few hundred years, from Queen Elizabeth II to Queen Victoria and her father. There are many pictures of royalty, such as those of King George VI, Prince Philip, and there are even some photographs of royalty with other important British political figures, like Winston Churchill. Several more important moments in Canadian history have been captured and are present in the museum. A record of the Halifax explosion is framed along with a description of the events and describes the explosion and the subsequent consequences that occurred after the incident. Along with a plaque of the Confederation of Canada, there is a picture that is entitled Fathers of Confederation, which shows and names all of the Fathers of Confederation. The Mt Hanley Schoolhouse Museum has been showing the wonderful history of the local community, Nova Scotia, and Canada, privately for over 40 years and publicly since 2005, to both Canadians and tourists from other countries. It will continue to provide a unique perspective into the past for many years to come.